Bedford, PA, stop number 7, James Smith at the Fort Bedford Museum.
Now, this video segment should also take place right around or in Fort Bedford Museum. You shouldn't have moved much from your previous segment. And this is about a man named James Smith. James Smith was a 16-year-old kid that lived in this area. James Smith was one of the fellows hired by the British to build their road. If you remember, I talked in the earlier segment about the British campaign against the French who were holed up at Fort Duquesne, and they were building a road to knock them off. What they did was they hired local guys to build that road. The very first PennDOT workers were locals from Bedford County, many of them. This was, of course, before the orange barrels and orange cones, but PennDOT workers nonetheless. James Smith and his road crew are working west of Fort Bedford. They are out building road whenever the road foreman notices there's some Indian activity up ahead, and he's a little bit concerned. You see, the concern is that this is during war, and many of the Indians were fighting on the side of the French. So, for safety reasons, the commander suggested to James and a friend of James, get back to Fort Bedford, ride back, see if you can rouse some troops. Give me 10, 20, 30 British troops up here to watch us, because I don't want to get ourselves into trouble with an Indian attack. James and his buddy make their way back on horse. While they're riding, Indians popped out of the bushes and ambushed them. James's friend was shot and killed. James was dragged down off his horse. They dragged him down, stripped him naked, and beat the living daylights out of the kid. Now, in these days, the Indians would often kill the male captives that they had, but they would sometimes adopt women and children into the tribe. James Smith was 16 years old at the time. What to do, what to do, what to do. He was kind of on the cusp. The Indians decided they would put James to a test to see if he was a white man or if he had maybe not yet been infected with what they thought was white man's cowardice or thinking. So what they did was they put him through a gauntlet. 2 rows of Indians. James, wearing nothing but a blindfold, was put through the gauntlet. And every Indian in it beat him with their fist, a club, a rock, whatever they had at hand. James Smith, by the time he got at the end of that 2 lines of Indians, was beaten and bloodied, but he hadn't made a sound. And the Indians thought that was a pretty good sign. And as a result, they adopted him into their tribe. James Smith is now a full-fledged Indian in their mind. And James Smith lived with them for 5 years. He never escaped. James Smith, I will tell you, when he was with the Indians, developed great love for some, great hatred for others, but a respect overall for the Indian nation. While he was with them, James Smith was taught how the Indians did things, how they hunted, how they would fish, how they would fight war. James Smith, when he was released, came back to the Bedford County area and maybe to the east of this area as well. When he returned to this area, James Smith, in his mid-20s, was a celebrity. Here's a guy everybody wanted to get to know. Why? Well, think about it. You're a Scotsman, British, you're German, and you move to this area. And yes, you sure are rough and tumble. You're a rough and rugged man. You know things like chopping down trees. You know how to get water out of the ground, or you know how to paddle a canoe. But you know what you don't know? You don't know this particular area like the Indians do. You don't know that a particular type of tree, if you boil the bark, you get a medicine. You don't know navigation of certain waterways in November. There's a lot of things that James had learned from the Indians that the local fellows, the white settlers, could learn from him. As a result, James Smith was on everybody's A-list for parties. James Smith was a guy you just had to get to know. And the best of these guys became his best friends, and they called themselves the Black Boys. The Black Boys would get together with James and learn how he would hunt, learn how he would fight war. They would strip down to loincloths, paint up their faces like the Indians did with black mud, maybe some red paint, and they would hoop and holler around the woods. A lot of men pay a lot of money to do that today, but back then they did her for free. So James Smith's Black Boys learned how to do things the Indians' way. The Black Boys were a tight band, and whenever the Black Boys learned of what was happening in the Bedford area, the Fort Bedford area, that the British were not enforcing the law against trading illegal weapons with the Indians, they, along with the other local population, were outraged. And these guys decided to do something about it. And here's what they did. James Smith had a buddy that lived near Fort Loudon, about an hour east of Fort Bedford in your car, if you were driving, or a day's ride east of Fort Bedford back in those days. His buddy would keep an eye open for some of the traders that they knew were causing the problems. And when he'd see one of these groups of men, he would hop on his horse, pass them, make his way to James's house hours ahead of these guys, knock on James's door. James would get up, go out, wake up or get up some of his friends, and they would go make up like Indians, loincloths, war paint, wait along the path of these guys. As these guys, hours later, in a slow-moving wagon, came down through James's group, they would jump out of the bushes, guns drawn. They would haul these guys down off the wagon, strip them naked, beat the tar out of them, because that makes it all worthwhile. They would then unhook their horses from their wagon, lead the horses into the creek, bang, shoot the horses in the head. They would then take the goods off of these men's wagon, put it onto James's wagon, and set their wagons afire. So these guys are now naked and bleeding in a ditch, dead horse in the creek, burned up wagon, and no more stuff. And James Smith and the Black Boys, we think, might have invented the phrase, "You fellas have a nice day." The idea was, maybe not have a nice day, the idea was, I'm sure they said, don't do it again. But it did happen again. Traders once again made their way, traders who were selling illegal arms. And James's buddy saw it again. He did the same thing. He rode west and got some of James's men because James that day wasn't available. And some of James Smith's Black Boys waited along the trail for these guys. And as they came down through, they jumped out of the bushes and pulled the same routine. Unfortunately, this time, there happened to be a British captain on patrol nearby. Was it a setup? Sure sounds like it to me. And I'm sure it sounded like it to them, too. So the British captain captured these Black Boys trying to steal from honest Philadelphia merchants. At least that's how it's portrayed. So James Smith's Black Boys were brought here to Fort Bedford. They were put in the stockade in irons, and they were being held for thievery. James Smith comes back to the area. James Smith is incensed, and he decides he's going to do something about it. And what he does was, he tells the British, he tells everybody, that he's going to raise an army of about 100, 200 fellas. You give me a week or two, and I can get people from as far away as New York, far south as Virginia. They'll come together, because I have friends that far away, and we're going to get a bunch of guys and get my friends out. So the British commandant now knows what James's plan is. He's going to attack in a couple of weeks with 100 to 200 guys. Don't worry. British commandant thinks, I'll be ready for him. Well, the fact was James had no intention of doing that. James's intention was, the very next day, he sneaks out of his house with just a handful of Black Boys. He sneaks out from under the nose of the British, who had a British private watching James's cabin to keep tabs on how many troops started showing up. He never knew James left. James made his way west, and they camped outside of Fort Bedford quietly. The very next day, the British sentry, one on duty, opens the gate to Fort Bedford. Why? There is no attack coming today. We know it's a week from now, or longer. As the sentry opens the gate, James Smith and the Black Boys make their way across the open ground. The British sentry sees him, raises his weapon, bang! One shot is fired. That's all he had in his gun. And James Smith and the Black Boys are on him with their guns. They never fired a shot. They dragged the sentry down off the gate. They then went in. They went into the British barracks where the British soldiers were still sleeping. Woke them up, dragged them out. You know what they did to them? They stripped them naked and beat the tar out of them. No, I'm just kidding. They dragged them out. They held them captive. They went and woke up the local blacksmith. The local blacksmith comes down to get James's men out of their chains. By this time, word has spread through the town of Bedford. Do you know what James and his boys did? They rousted the British out of Fort Bedford. Pretty good. Pretty smart. And the locals were happy about it, because you know what? It's about time the British get what for. So in 1769, James Smith and the Black Boys captured Fort Bedford from the British Army. Now, I tell you, they weren't measured in thousands at that time. There were only dozens of British troops here. But at the same time, it was an important victory. James Smith made the point, we've had it up to here with your British rule, or if you will, lack of enforcement of the law. So why is Fort Bedford not considered to be the first fort captured in American history? Well, were we Americans in 1769 or not? Sure seems to me like the spirit that I told you about, being fed up with British rule or their lack of enforcing law, was an American spirit. Seems to me that James Smith seems to be an American kind of guy. But after they captured Fort Bedford and got his men, and by the way, some whiskey, some flour, some guns, and some gunpowder, out of Fort Bedford, they gave Fort Bedford back. They didn't want Fort Bedford. So the Fort Bedford was turned back over to the British. After they left, I'm sure the British had a meeting, and the British meeting went something like this. This will never happen again. Gosh, this is embarrassing. We're either going to A, man Fort Bedford so there is no opportunity for the locals to capture it again, or B, we're going to shut her down. The British opted for choice B. They shut down Fort Bedford around 1770. And in 1770, 6 years before the American Revolution, Fort Bedford was no more. Our next stop on the tour is the Espy House. Follow me. All you need to do if you're facing the sign for Fort Bedford Museum is turn right, walk up the hill. At the corner, turn left, walk down the street about halfway down the block to the blue and yellow sign that says the Espy House, looks like this, and stop there. So let's go.